Ah, youth. It's full of potential, ambition, and sometimes absolute madness. History has seen many powerful rulers, but when power falls into the hands of a teenager, someone too young to understand it, yet too powerful for anyone to stop, things can spiral out of control fast. Some of these young rulers turned their nations into playgrounds of excess, others became obsessed with violence, and a few simply lost their minds entirely. So today, let me tell you about 4 young tyrants who got power way too early and had no idea how to handle it. First, let's talk about Emperor Gabalus, the teenage Roman ruler who turned the empire into his personal playground. Born in 204 AD, he ascended to the throne at the age of just 14, placed there by his ambitious grandmother after a political coup. The Roman Empire had seen its fair share of eccentric rulers, but Elagabalus took things to an entirely new level. Unlike his predecessors, who at least tried to balance their excesses with some form of governance, Elagabalus didn't even pretend to care. His first act, dragging a giant black meteorite from Syria to Rome and declaring it the embodiment of his god, forcing senators to bow before it. But that was just the start. Elagabalus abandoned all sense of tradition, appointing random lovers and favorites to high-ranking positions while ignoring experienced officials. He openly dressed as a woman, scandalizing Rome's elite, and allegedly offered vast sums of money to any doctor who could transform him into a woman completely, a bizarre request for the time. His obsession with pleasure and excess became the defining feature of his rule. He threw extravagant feasts where guests were showered with gold coins and jewels, but also hosted cruel pranks where he'd serve guests fake food, lock them in rooms with wild animals, or release venomous snakes into the crowd just for his own amusement. His nights were spent wandering the streets of Rome dressed as a prostitute, frequenting brothels and forcing the nobility to participate in degrading games. Even in an empire known for decadence, this was too much. His erratic rule and complete disregard for military affairs led to growing discontent among Rome's elite, and by the age of 18, his own guards had had enough. The Praetorian Guard turned on him, dragging him from his palace and brutally killing him, tossing his body into the Tiber River. His reign lasted just 4 years, but his reputation as one of Rome's most deranged emperors has endured for centuries. If Elagabalus was a ruler who indulged in excess, then our next tyrant was one who embraced pure, unrestrained cruelty. Ivan the Terrible of Russia wasn't always terrible, at least not at first. Born in 1530, he became Grand Prince of Moscow at just 3 years old. Obviously, a toddler couldn't rule a kingdom, so he was surrounded by nobles and regents who fought for control. This childhood, marked by violence, betrayal, and isolation, shaped Ivan into the ruler he would become. He learned quickly that power came from fear, and by the time he took full control at the age of 16, he wasted no time in making sure everyone understood that he was in charge. At first, he showed promise. He reformed laws, expanded Russia's borders, and strengthened its administration. But power has a way of warping a man, especially one raised in paranoia. Soon, Ivan became obsessed with rooting out traitors even where none existed. His cruelty spiraled into madness when his beloved wife, Anastasia, died suddenly, possibly poisoned. Ivan was convinced that the nobles had murdered her, and from that moment his rule turned into a blood-soaked nightmare. He created the Oprichnina, a secret police force that acted as his personal death squad, dressed in black, riding black horses, and torturing and executing anyone suspected of disloyalty. Entire towns were massacred on his orders. In one particularly infamous case, he personally oversaw the destruction of the city of Novgorod, suspecting its people of treason. His men slaughtered thousands, tossing bodies into the freezing river, burning entire families alive, and even executing pregnant women. His rage was unpredictable. One day he'd reward a noble with riches, the next he'd have them skinned alive for imagined disloyalty. But perhaps his most infamous act came at the height of his madness. In 1581, during a fit of rage, he beat his own son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, to death with a staff, leaving Russia without a competent successor. The shock of this act devastated him, and he died a few years later, leaving Russia in chaos. But not all young tyrants were born into established empires. Some seized power themselves, rising from nothing and proving that youth and cruelty make a deadly combination. This brings us to Junger, Emperor of China, a ruler so reckless that his own officials begged him to take his job seriously, only for them to be executed when he refused. Born in 1491, he became emperor of the Ming dynasty at 14 years old, and from the moment he took the throne, it was clear that governing was the last thing on his mind. Rather than rule, he turned the Forbidden City into his personal amusement park, hiring actors, magicians, and even building his own fake foreign kingdom within the palace, where he'd pretend to be a general, issuing commands in made-up languages and forcing his officials to play along. He abandoned government affairs entirely, letting corrupt ministers make decisions while he spent his days drinking, hunting, and kidnapping women to populate his personal pleasure palaces. He even staged fake military campaigns, riding out with his army dressed as a common soldier, demanding his own troops pretend not to recognize him. At one point, he declared himself a separate ruler from the actual Ming emperor himself, and issued official decrees from his alternate identity. His recklessness nearly cost China dearly. When Mongol raiders attacked the north, the emperor was nowhere to be found, too busy partying. Officials had to forge royal orders just to get the army to act. And now our fourth young tyrant, Bassa II, the 15-year-old self-declared emperor of the Central African Empire in 1977. He inherited his father's brutal legacy, ruling with an iron fist over his subjects while indulging in a life of excess. Despite being a teenager, Bassa II saw himself as a modern-day Napoleon, styling himself with elaborate military uniforms and forcing citizens to worship him as a god. He squandered the nation's wealth on palaces, private zoos, and insane parties, while his people starved. His temper was legendary. He reportedly executed teachers for not addressing his letters with the proper titles, and anyone who dared question his rule was sent to prison, or worse. His downfall came when his father, the infamous dictator Jean-Bedel Bokassa, was overthrown in 1979, leading to the collapse of his short but terrifying rule. Unlike other young tyrants in history, he had the rare luck of surviving his downfall, though he spent the rest of his life in exile, a footnote in the long list of brutal dictators who burned too bright too fast. What makes these rulers so fascinating is not just their cruelty, but their youth. Most tyrants become monsters over time, but these rulers were barely old enough to understand power before they were consumed by it. Their reigns were short, but their impact was unforgettable. Whether it was Gabalus turning Rome into a circus, Ivan the Terrible drenching Russia in blood, Junger treating his empire like a joke, or Bokassa II playing emperor in a crumbling dictatorship, these young rulers proved one thing: absolute power in the hands of the immature is a dangerous thing. Some rulers are born great, others achieve greatness, and some, like these, let power destroy them before they even had a chance to grow up.